With assisted dying, though, as I've talked with one of the people who support those legislation, it's really interesting how opinions differ, and even among conservatives, even among Labour, when you've seen the MPs that voted for the legislation, it's a big number of those who voted against.
Sure. Well, it's a very personal issue. I personally, if we want to talk about that, have always had a lot more sympathy with people who want to have control over how they end their life. I saw myself, friends and so on who had particularly this motor neurone, and I watched how the end was just very awful, frankly, and painful. And I've always had a sort of personal fear of that, and so I've always felt I want to be able to control the very ending of my life, particularly if I'm in a lot of pain. But it's like one of those things that when you then talk to someone who's vehemently opposed, I listen very carefully to what they say, and I'm put in doubt about that, because they say, how will it work? How will people not be pressured? Look what's happened in other countries where it's become now the main cause of death. It's assisted dying, a very high percentage of it. And I totally sympathise with that. So I think that knowing the problem with the modern world, if you ask me what problem I've encountered, which I find most disagreeable, is the assumption that everyone has to be right, and that politics is pure, and this is the right answer, whatever it is. And it's just not the case. There are grey areas, there are vagaries, there has to be elasticity in the system, and in many instances, there aren't necessarily right answers. There are only compromises. And I think understanding that and being grown up about it and being honest with Britain would have actually probably put us in a different position in terms of sort of maturity of the political debate that we have. And assisted dying is a good example of that.
No, I think in terms of this bill, I can definitely understand both points of views, and I can definitely sympathize with both. But one of the bills that I just cannot understand from my perspective, probably more conservative perspective, because I'm coming from a conservative background.
Good, I'm glad about that.
Is the abortion bill.
Okay.
I will probably never be able to understand that. Why would you allow it up to birth?
Well, forgive me, I don't think that hasn't come to the House of Lords yet, the abortion bill, has it? I didn't.
No, I think, but MPs have voted on it.
Okay. Yes, I think I saw that was this week. And that's pretty significant.
It's very significant.
I feel, in all honesty, again, I'm very torn between the two. I think we've looked at abortion as post-conception contraception, which I think is very dangerous. I think it's used as a lifestyle choice. I think that in many instances, and I think that is, to not have a sense of morality as a state around that, I think is a real issue. And it's come from the desire of the state to be amoral and acultural. And so the destruction of our British culture, the decision that we shouldn't have strong values, we shouldn't have moral views on how people behave, how public servants behave. It should only be whether or not they've checked the sort of safeguarding checklist or whatever rubbish it is. That's a real problem for our society and our country. So the sense of morality and culture is always what beats everything else, legislation and structures at the end of the day. It's at the core of it. So we need to get back to having a sense of morality so we can have a moral debate. And I think it's right to have a moral debate about these things. At the same time, there are many instances where it's absolutely right at the right time, given the right circumstances, to make sure that women have a choice over their bodies. So it's as you say, it's really complicated. But I do think moral debate in society is very important, and we become very frightened about that. And I think we need to return to the time when actually the state exhibits an element of morality and strong British culture.
But in my opinion, and just to be clear, I've spoken to Tonia Antoniazzi in person in one of my internships. So I got to know her and how she thinks. And she really cares about women. I cannot say bad words about her intentions.
Sure. But
it's probably the manifestations of how we're going to help women that differ from the party to party. And I think as abortions have virtually almost been allowed in this country, at least in the latest years, up to 24 weeks is totally fine and gives women exactly the right to choose what to do with their body. And this is basically my argument. This is now turning into the extreme, and every time history or politicians turn into extreme, public doesn't like it.
No.
The same way as Trump does sometimes.
Yeah.
Turn to extremes, and public doesn't like it.
I think we had that debate over the sort of the so-called trans wars, the trans issues, where the principle of common sense, decency around how people want to define themselves. And this is actually quite controversial. Actually, as a conservative, people should be allowed to define themselves. I'm a personal libertarian. the great joy of modern society is you can define yourself how you are. I want to define myself how I am. So I don't have much trouble with people who don't think that's a good idea. But then you have the friction between people's liberties. And the problem is, again, when I said, I think it's a good idea that people should define themselves. Someone says, what about in the sports or the female restroom or whatever? And then you say, well, of course that's
it's just a talking point.
That's ridiculous. And we've got to actually have a sense of ridiculous. And that goes back to the principle of morality, common sense, and culture about decency and what is right. And you shouldn't ever let the decency of another. You shouldn't take advantage of the decency of other people. Is my point. So if you look at the abortion issue, I'm not an expert on this, and I'm sensitive about commenting on it. But ultimately, there are some obvious things that you should be able to do, and then at the same time, you've got rights of other people's rights where there's friction, where you have to come to a sensible compromise, and that's what society is. It's decency and compromise, but people wanting to compromise on both sides. It's not a question of I want to compromise. We've got to go back to the idea that it's our responsibility. This is a conservative philosophy. You have your personal freedom, but equally you have your personal responsibility. And so you should do everything you can not to impinge upon the freedoms and rights of other people as a result of the fact you have your own rights. That's conservatism, and that's very different to socialism.
And one of the most interesting questions in my mind that people ask to question the democracy of the Western world nowadays is whether the parliament is really that representative as it's supposed to be. Here we can see how Labour alone, maybe with Lib Democrats, can achieve a majority and pass a bill like abortion, like assisted dying, although to a lesser extent.
I think they were free votes on both, were they not? It certainly was on assisted dying. I don't think it was votes, but anyway. But fair enough. They could do what they liked.
There was a large majority, certainly, on the Labour side. And this questions whether the voting that happened to take place was representative of how people think in the country.
Well, so firstly, I'm a passionate believer in representative democracy. We don't run a referendum-style democracy here, and in fact, when we have in the past, I think it's led to some outcomes which people have found very unsatisfactory, because it's not our principal position. So you send a representative to Westminster, and frankly, you can 5 years later decide whether you want to boot them out or not. So I'm very comfortable with MPs following their conscience. I think they have to follow their party line because that's how you elected them. So I don't have too much trouble with our MPs who then break away from that, because I sort of think that's the contract you had, soft though it is. So I'm not so worried about that. I think what's more relevant for me at the moment is that Labour has a huge and untrammeled majority. It must be one of the biggest postal majorities ever. And so there's an assumption that somehow they must be right in what they do because they've got a huge majority. They must represent the UK population better, but of course they don't. They received a very low share of the vote of a relatively low turnout. I think they got 20% or around that of the voting population actually voted for them. And that's hardly some sweeping majority. So we've got to be quite careful about that. And that's why institutions such as the House of Lords is important, because it just gives a bit of an opportunity to smooth out some of these sort of excess urges that politicians will claim they have a strong mandate when actually they don't.
And of